Something fundamental just shifted in the Pacific, and most people aren't paying attention. For the first time since World War II, Japan is preparing to export lethal weapons, not to a traditional ally, but to the Philippines, a nation sitting right on China's doorstep. This isn't just another arms deal. This is Tokyo abandoning 7 decades of pacifist doctrine, and Beijing knows exactly what it means. The Japanese are planning to send Patriot missile systems to Manila, and China's response has been nothing short of explosive. We're watching the architecture of Asian security being rewritten in real time, and the implications go far beyond missiles and military hardware. This is about spheres of influence, about America's role in containing Chinese expansion, and about how quickly old rules dissolve when great powers feel threatened. What's happening right now in the South China Sea could define the next chapter of global conflict or global cooperation. The question isn't whether this matters, the question is whether we understand what's actually at stake before it's too late. Let me walk you through what's really happening here, because the surface narrative misses the deeper currents entirely. What we're witnessing is Japan systematically dismantling the very foundation of its post-war identity, and it's happening so methodically, so deliberately, that most observers are treating it like just another defense deal. It's not. This is a nation that has spent nearly 80 years defining itself through pacifism, through constitutional restraints on military power, now quietly becoming an arms exporter to one of the most contested regions on Earth. The Type 03 missile system that Tokyo wants to send to Manila isn't just hardware. It's a statement about the new architecture of power in the Pacific, and Beijing understands this perfectly. The technical details matter here because they reveal intent. The Type 03 is a truck-mobile medium-range surface-to-air missile system with about a 50-kilometer range, designed to intercept aircraft and cruise missiles. It's deployed on an 8x8 mobile chassis, each launcher carrying 6 interceptor missiles in canisters. Japan developed this system domestically back in the 1990s through Mitsubishi Electric, specifically to replace their aging American-made Hawk missiles. The system uses active radar homing, which means once it locks onto a target, it doesn't need continuous guidance from ground stations. Fire and forget. It's a capable, proven platform. Japan already has these missiles deployed on Ishigaki Island at the far end of the Nansei chain, positioned to counter Chinese military activity near Taiwan and in the East China Sea. Now they're planning to deploy the same system on Yonaguni Island, which sits just 110 kilometers from Taiwan. Think about that geography for a moment. That's not defensive positioning in any traditional sense. That's forward deployment in what would be the opening theater of any Taiwan contingency. And here's where it gets interesting from a strategic perspective. The Philippines has expressed serious interest in acquiring this system for its military. Manila is locked in an ongoing confrontation with Beijing over the disputed South China Sea, where Chinese Coast Guard and Air Force activities have become increasingly aggressive throughout 2024 and into this year. The Philippines occupies a critical position in what strategists call the first island chain, that arc of territory stretching from Japan through Taiwan and down through the Philippines and into Southeast Asia. Control of this chain determines whether China can project power into the Pacific or remains bottled up in its near seas. The nearest Philippine island sits about 140 kilometers from Taiwan. So when Japan talks about exporting missile systems to the Philippines, they're not just helping an ally improve its air defenses. They're building an integrated defensive network that spans the entire first island chain, linking Japanese, Philippine, and by extension American military capabilities into a unified system designed to contain Chinese expansion. But to understand why China is reacting with such fury to this development, you have to understand what Japan is actually changing here. Since 1967, Japan has operated under what's known as the 3 principles on arms exports. These principles essentially banned the export of weapons to communist countries, countries under UN arms embargoes, and countries involved in or likely to be involved in international conflicts. Then, in 1976, the Japanese government went further and banned arms exports across the board, with only narrow exceptions for technology transfers to the United States under their mutual defense agreement. This wasn't just policy, this was the cornerstone of Japan's post-war identity as a pacifist nation, a country that had renounced war and military aggression as instruments of national policy. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution explicitly states that Japan will never maintain land, sea, or air forces or other war potential. Of course, Japan does have a military, the self-defense forces, but the pretense has always been that these forces are purely defensive and would never be used for overseas aggression or to support other nations in military operations. All of that is now being systematically dismantled. In 2014, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's government replaced the old three principles with the new three principles on transfer of defense equipment and technology. The language changed, but more importantly, the restrictions loosened. The new principles allowed exports of defense equipment in cases that would contribute to international peace and security, strengthen security cooperation with the United States and other like-minded countries, or help maintain Japan's defense industrial base. Then in December 2023, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's government revised these principles again, further loosening the restrictions. They allowed for the export of finished lethal weapons, not just components, to countries with which Japan has licensing agreements. Japan started exporting Patriot missile interceptors to the United States. Now the current government under Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is preparing to scrap what's known as the five-category rule, which currently limits defense equipment exports to items related to rescue, transport, warning, surveillance, and minesweeping. Once that rule is abolished, probably sometime in the first half of 2025, Japan will be free to export complete lethal weapon systems like the Type 03 to countries like the Philippines. Let's be very clear about what this means. Japan is not just tweaking policy around the edges. They're fundamentally redefining what it means to be Japan in the 21st century. They're walking away from the constraints imposed after World War II, after conflict in which Japanese militarism devastated much of Asia and led directly to Japan's own destruction and occupation. The Potsdam Declaration, which established the terms of Japan's surrender, explicitly stated that Japan would not be permitted to rearm for war. The Japanese constitution, drafted under American occupation, enshrined pacifism as a core national principle. For nearly 80 years, successive Japanese governments have honored these commitments, not because they were forced to, but because the Japanese people themselves, having experienced the horrors of total war, embraced pacifism as a defining national value. Public opinion polls have consistently shown that a majority of Japanese citizens support maintaining Article 9 and oppose any moves toward remilitarization. Yet, here we are. Defense spending is being ramped up dramatically. Prime Minister Takaichi announced in October that Japan intends to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP by the end of March next year, a full 2 years ahead of the timeline set by previous governments. 2% of GDP puts Japan's defense budget at around $100 billion annually, making it one of the largest military spenders in the world. They're not just buying equipment for their own use, they're building an export industry, they're becoming an arms dealer, and the first major customer in line is the Philippines, a country that's in an active territorial dispute with China, where tensions have repeatedly escalated to the point of physical confrontation. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have rammed Philippine ships, used military-grade lasers against Philippine personnel, fired water cannons that have injured Filipino sailors. This is not a stable, peaceful environment. This is a powder keg, and Japan is about to start shipping advanced weapon systems into the middle of it. China's reaction has been predictably intense, but also revealing in its specificity. Chinese military experts and official spokespeople have characterized Japan's moves as a blatant breakaway from post-war restrictions and a dangerous sign of the revival of militarism. They've invoked the memory of World War II, when Japanese militarism launched aggressive wars and imposed colonial rule on neighboring countries, including China and the Philippines. They've pointed out that Japan occupied the South China Sea Islands during the war and bears serious historical responsibilities for the suffering it caused throughout the region. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning called Japan's deployment of offensive weapons to islands close to Taiwan a deliberate move that breeds regional tensions and stokes military confrontation. The language Beijing is using is not diplomatic boilerplate. It's accusatory, angry, and laced with historical grievance. They're calling this extremely dangerous. They're warning that it should put Japan's neighbors and the international community on maximum alert. Now you might ask, why is China so upset about defensive missile systems? These are surface-to-air missiles, designed to shoot down aircraft and cruise missiles. They're not offensive weapons in the traditional sense. They can't strike targets in China. They're purely defensive tools, right? Well, yes and no. In modern warfare, the distinction between offensive and defensive systems becomes increasingly blurred. A robust air defense network doesn't just protect your own territory. It creates a protective umbrella that allows you to operate offensively with impunity. If the Philippines has advanced air defense systems covering key approaches to its territory, that degrades China's ability to establish air superiority in any potential conflict. It forces Chinese planners to allocate resources to suppressing those defenses before they can conduct other operations. More importantly, these missile systems don't exist in isolation. They're part of a broader network of military cooperation between Japan, the Philippines, and the United States. In September, a new defense pact between Tokyo and Manila took effect, allowing Japanese military forces to deploy in the Philippines for the first time since World War II. Think about the symbolism of that for a moment. The last time Japanese forces were in the Philippines, they were occupying the country during one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific War. Now they're back, but this time as allies, and this time with American blessing and support. Less than a month after that pact took effect, Japan and the Philippines held a 5-day joint military exercise, including the delivery of emergency relief supplies to the Philippine island of Cebu. That drill was conducted one day before China's People's Liberation Army held its annual joint exercise with Malaysia. 2 days later, Japan participated in another joint drill, this one led by the Philippines and the United States, involving multiple regional allies. These aren't random scheduling coincidences. These are coordinated signals, carefully choreographed displays of alliance solidarity designed to send a message to Beijing. The message is simple. If you push too hard in the South China Sea, you're not just dealing with the Philippines. You're dealing with an integrated network of American allies and partners, all working together, all increasingly armed with advanced weapon systems, all committed to resisting Chinese expansion. And this is where the missile export becomes part of a much larger strategic picture. The United States has been working for years to build what it calls a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is diplomatic language for a containment strategy aimed at China. The cornerstone of this strategy is the alliance system, the hub and spokes network of bilateral defense treaties that links the United States to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. Historically, these alliances have been bilateral, with each country connected to Washington, but not necessarily to each other. What's changing now is the emergence of multilateral cooperation. Japan and the Philippines are signing defense pacts directly with each other. Japan, the United States, and the Philippines are conducting trilateral military exercises. Australia, the UK, and the United States have formed AUKUS, a security partnership focused on advanced military capabilities, including nuclear submarines. The Quad, comprising the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, is deepening cooperation on maritime security. All of these arrangements have one thing in common. They're designed to counter Chinese influence and, if necessary, to fight and win a conflict against China in the Western Pacific. The Philippines occupies a uniquely important position in this architecture. Under former President Rodrigo Duterte, Manila adopted a conciliatory approach toward China, downplaying territorial disputes in exchange for Chinese investment and economic cooperation. When President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. took office in June 2022, he reversed that policy completely. The Marcos administration has implemented what it calls assertive transparency, publicizing videos of Chinese Coast Guard aggression toward Philippine vessels. They've reinforced the physical infrastructure on Philippine-occupied atolls in the South China Sea, most notably at Second Thomas Shoal in the Spratly Islands, where the Philippines deliberately grounded a warship back in 1999 and has maintained a small military garrison ever since. They've strengthened defense ties with the United States, expanding the number of bases where American forces can operate under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. They've signed visiting forces agreements with Canada, with plans to pursue similar agreements with France, Singapore, the UK, Germany, and India. They've tripled their patrol area in the South China Sea in coordination with the Military, Coast Guard, and Fisheries Bureau. Manila is no longer trying to manage its relationship with Beijing through quiet diplomacy. They're pushing back publicly, loudly, and with growing international support. China's response has been escalatory. Throughout 2024, Chinese Coast Guard vessels engaged in increasingly aggressive tactics against Philippine ships, conducting resupply missions to Second Thomas Shoal. There have been multiple collisions. Chinese vessels have blocked Philippine boats, used water cannons with enough force to injure personnel, employed military-grade lasers against Philippine crews. In one incident, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel collided with a Chinese Navy ship while both were trying to expel a Philippine Coast Guard vessel from Scarborough Shoal. These aren't accidents. They're deliberate shows of force designed to intimidate the Philippines into backing down from its territorial claims. The problem for Beijing is that the strategy isn't working. Instead of backing down, the Philippines is doubling down. seeking more international support, conducting more joint patrols with the United States and its allies, and now potentially acquiring advanced Japanese weapon systems that will significantly enhance its ability to defend its claimed territory. This is where Japan's missile export plans become a direct challenge to Chinese strategy in the region. Beijing's approach in the South China Sea has been based on what's called salami slicing, the gradual accumulation of control through small incremental actions that individually don't justify a major military response but collectively result in significant territorial gains. China has built artificial islands on disputed reefs, militarized those islands with airfields and missile systems, asserted administrative control over vast swaths of the sea through the Nine-Line Claim, deployed Coast Guard and maritime militia forces to harass other claimants, and used its economic leverage to discourage countries from pushing back too hard. The strategy has been remarkably successful. China now controls the Paracel Islands entirely. It has established a strong presence throughout the Spratly Islands. It effectively controls Scarborough Shoal, which lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The question is whether this pattern can continue indefinitely or whether we're approaching an inflection point where the costs and risks of continued expansion outweigh the benefits. Japan's decision to export weapons to the Philippines represents a significant increase in those costs and risks. If the Philippines acquires Type 03 missile systems and deploys them to cover key approach routes to its territory, that complicates Chinese operations in the area. If those systems are integrated with American and Japanese intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, they become even more effective. If Japan is willing to supply not just missiles but also used warships, as has been reported, and potentially other military equipment, then the Philippines can modernize its military capabilities much faster than Beijing expected. And if other countries in the region start following the same pattern, acquiring Japanese weapons and deepening defense cooperation with Tokyo and Washington, then China faces a much more formidable resistance to its expansion than it did a decade ago when it began this campaign of incremental control. But there's another layer to this that we need to examine carefully. The question isn't just whether Japan is supplying weapons to the Philippines. The question is why Japan is doing this now, and what it tells us about Tokyo's assessment of the regional security environment. Japan doesn't make major foreign policy shifts casually. This is a country with deep institutional memory, where decisions are carefully deliberated through multiple layers of bureaucracy and political consensus. For Japan to abandon its long-standing arms export ban, to increase defense spending so dramatically, to deploy offensive weapon systems to islands near Taiwan, to sign defense pacts allowing military deployments in the Philippines for the first time since World War II, all of this represents a fundamental reorientation of Japanese strategic thinking. The driving force behind this reorientation is fear. Not panic, not hysteria, but a cold assessment that the regional security environment is deteriorating and that Japan needs to take action to protect its interests before it's too late. The fear centers on Taiwan. Japan has been increasingly explicit about this. Prime Minister Takaichi said last month that a Chinese naval blockade or other aggressive moves against Taiwan could trigger a Japanese military response. That's an extraordinary statement. Japan is essentially putting China on notice that if Beijing moves against Taiwan, Tokyo will treat it as a direct threat to Japanese security and will respond militarily. This represents a complete abandonment of Japan's traditional strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan question. Why is Japan willing to take such a hard line? Because the stakes for Japan could not be higher. Taiwan sits astride Japan's primary sea lanes of communication, the maritime routes through which Japan imports virtually all of its energy and much of its food. If China controlled Taiwan, it would control those sea lanes. It would have the ability to strangle the Japanese economy at will. Beyond that, if China successfully annexed Taiwan by force without significant consequences, it would demonstrate that the American security guarantee in East Asia is worthless. Japan's entire post-war security strategy has been based on the assumption that the United States would defend Japan against external threats. If that assumption proves false, Japan would face an existential choice between accommodation with China or the rapid development of an independent military capability, possibly including nuclear weapons. This is the context in which Japan's arms exports need to be understood. Tokyo is not trying to build a defense industry for profit. They are not looking to compete with American or European arms manufacturers in global markets. What they're doing is building a network of allied capabilities that can resist Chinese expansion collectively. The Type 03 missiles going to the Philippines are one small piece of a much larger strategic mosaic. Japan is also working on joint development programs with the United Kingdom and Italy for next-generation fighter aircraft. They are cooperating with the United States on missile defense systems. They are upgrading their own military capabilities across the board, from submarines to cyber warfare to space-based assets. And they're doing all of this while trying to maintain the fiction that Article 9 of the Constitution still constrains their military activities. It's a legal fiction that's wearing increasingly thin. The Chinese see all of this very clearly, which is why their reaction to the proposed missile exports has been so sharp. From Beijing's perspective, Japan is not just helping the Philippines improve its defenses. Japan is leading the construction of an anti-China coalition that seeks to contain Chinese power and prevent China from achieving what Beijing considers its natural and legitimate sphere of influence in East Asia. The historical parallels are impossible to ignore. In the 1930s, Japan built what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemism for Japanese imperial domination of the region. That empire was defeated and dismantled after World War II, but now, from China's point of view, Japan is trying to rebuild a sphere of influence, this time as a junior partner to American power, but with the same fundamental objective of limiting Chinese sovereignty and preventing China's rise as the dominant power in its own region. Whether you accept the Chinese narrative or not, and there are plenty of reasons to be skeptical of it, you have to acknowledge that Beijing genuinely believes this. They see American and Japanese actions in the region not as defensive measures to maintain stability and freedom of navigation, but as aggressive attempts to encircle China and prevent it from exercising what they view as its historical rights and contemporary power. The missile exports fit perfectly into this worldview. From Beijing's perspective, Japan is arming countries on China's periphery, specifically to threaten Chinese security and constrain Chinese power. The fact that these weapon systems are nominally defensive is irrelevant. What matters is that they're being positioned to contest Chinese control of what Beijing considers its near seas, and they're being supplied by a country that invaded and occupied China within living memory. This brings us to the most dangerous aspect of the current situation. We're not just watching a gradual escalation of tensions, we're watching both sides prepare for the possibility of actual conflict. China is militarizing the South China Sea, building up its navy and coast guard, improving its amphibious assault capabilities, and conducting exercises that simulate the invasion of Taiwan. Japan is abandoning constitutional restrictions on military power, increasing defense spending, deploying forward positions near Taiwan, and building an alliance network specifically designed to counter China. The Philippines is strengthening its military, expanding its defense partnerships, and showing no signs of backing down from its territorial claims despite sustained Chinese pressure. The United States is conducting freedom of navigation operations, selling advanced weapons to regional allies, deploying more forces to the region, and stating explicitly that it will defend the Philippines under the Mutual Defense Treaty if Philippine forces are attacked in the South China Sea. Every one of these actions makes sense from the perspective of the individual actor. Japan feels threatened and is taking steps to enhance its security. The Philippines is defending its territorial claims and sovereignty. The United States is supporting its allies and maintaining the international order it created after World War II. China is reclaiming what it sees as historically Chinese territory and establishing the regional dominance appropriate to its status as a great power. But when you put all of these rational individual actions together, what you get is a classic security dilemma, where each side's defensive measures are perceived as offensive threats by the other side, leading to an escalatory spiral that neither side wants, but neither side knows how to stop. The missile exports are one more turn of that spiral. Once Japan starts supplying weapons to the Philippines, China will feel compelled to respond, probably by intensifying its presence in the South China Sea, and possibly by taking more aggressive action against Philippine positions. That will lead the Philippines to request more support from Japan and the United States, which they will likely provide. China will then escalate further, and so on. The question is whether this process has a natural ceiling or whether it continues until someone miscalculates and we find ourselves in an actual shooting war that nobody intended, but that becomes unavoidable because the logic of escalation has its own momentum. I want to be very careful here not to engage in false equivalence. China's claims in the South China Sea are legally dubious at best. The 9-dash line has been rejected by international arbitration. China's use of force against Philippine vessels in Philippine waters is a clear violation of international law. Beijing's refusal to accept the jurisdiction of international courts and its insistence that territorial disputes can only be resolved through bilateral negotiations where China's superior power gives it overwhelming advantage. These are not the actions of a status quo power seeking to maintain stability. They are the actions of a revisionist power seeking to change the existing order to its advantage. Japan and the Philippines have legitimate security concerns. They have every right to defend their territory and to seek support from allies and partners. But acknowledging that doesn't make the situation any less dangerous. Rights and legitimacy matter, but so does power, and so does miscalculation, and so does the risk that a conflict nobody wants ends up happening anyway because the structural conditions make it almost inevitable. So where does this leave us? Japan is going to export those missiles to the Philippines. The necessary legal changes will be made, probably early next year. The Philippines will deploy them to key locations, probably covering approaches to major islands and critical infrastructure. China will protest vehemently and will likely take compensatory actions to demonstrate that it will not be deterred. The United States will support both Japan and the Philippines and will continue to expand its own military presence in the region. The other Southeast Asian countries will watch nervously and will try to avoid being forced to choose sides, but their room for maneuver is shrinking as the great power competition intensifies. And all of this will happen against the backdrop of the broader US-China strategic competition, where trade wars and technology restrictions and diplomatic tensions and military buildups are creating an increasingly adversarial relationship between the world's two largest economies.